he was found face down in a pillow with sparing of lividity, with no lividity around his nose and mouth.
A clearer picture is developing into what happened shortly before a television reporter was found dead in his hotel room. The woman last seen with him, who has been the center of the investigation, has officially been charged with his death. But police say she didn't act alone, and text messages between the two alleged accomplices is revealing so much more.
You know, we don't want Ms. Colbert to see the light of day again.
I'm Elizabeth Millner with Law&Crime. Police say Danette Colbert is no stranger to allegedly drugging and robbing victims who are typically men. She's even been dubbed the Bourbon Street Hustler. And what she probably wasn't expecting is for one of her victims to actually die as a result of her terrible scheming. But was she the one actually calling the shots? Well, it depends on how you interpret these text messages that were revealed in court.
We found correspondence and information where they were going back and forth. So we think they were working hand in hand in concert with each other on this. So that's basically where I'm going to leave it.
Kenner Police Chief Keith Conley was speaking about these two, Danette Colbert and Ricky White. Both have been charged in connection to the death of sports reporter Adan Manzano. Danette was initially charged with property crimes after she was caught with Adan's cell phone and credit cards. Then after his tox report was released, she was charged with second-degree murder. As for Ricky White, no murder charge for him, but he's still facing charges that are keeping him locked up with no bond.
He was charged with the property crimes of simple robbery, access device fraud, illegal transmission of monetary funds, bank fraud, and computer fraud.
So why are they both being held on no bond? Well, let's look into their robbery scheme, as detectives call it. According to a report by KMBC, detectives say the phrase knockout was used in messages found on Danette's phone. Police say she would target her victims by providing them with alcohol and alprazolam, a form of Xanax, while Ricky White would provide the rides. That's what they usually did. But in this case, Ricky didn't drive, but he allegedly paid for the rental car. Remember how I mentioned Danette was found with Adan's phone when she was initially arrested? Well, that was for a reason. Police say Danette would steal a victim's phone, get into the phone, get a text code, and access the victim's bank accounts. She even allegedly sent one message saying, "Got the phone code, he got money, waiting for him to sleep, about to check the ATM, then to you." She allegedly sent that text after she met Adan. Meanwhile, Ricky White never physically met him. Detective Jeffrey Fitzmaurice testified the intention wasn't to murder him, but to simply cause unconsciousness. Detective Fitzmaurice testified on the day Adan was found dead in his hotel room, which was on February 5th, Danette and Ricky communicated 30 times that day. He testified the text showed a pattern of behavior where Danette and even others asked for knockouts and then would send phone and bank info to Ricky. In court, their relationship was even described as a prostitute/pimp situation. And whether the intent was just to rob, which is terrible in itself, their alleged actions had devastating consequences.
Cause of death we have as the combined toxic effects of alprazolam, which is also known as Xanax, with ethanol, which is alcohol, along with what's called positional asphyxia. The positional asphyxia means that he was found face down in a pillow with sparing of lividity, with no lividity around his nose and mouth. The manner of death at this point is undetermined. Now, to give a little more detail on the intoxication, his alcohol level was 0.232, which, as most people know, is almost 3 times the legal limit of alcohol. His Xanax level was 25 nanograms per milliliter. Now, that's just a number, but to give you an idea, a person who's taking a milligram of Xanax 3 times a day, which is a very healthy dose of Xanax, would achieve a level of about 30 nanograms per milliliter. So it's not an insignificant amount of Xanax in his system. In most cases of an overdose of Xanax, especially, and I'm talking about Xanax alone, those levels are usually over 100. However, when combined with other central nervous systems depressants, that amount goes way down. So those combined effects is what causes where we are today. People ask about, why is it undetermined? Well, in most cases of overdose deaths, the manner of death is accidental. Okay, and that's whether or not there's positional asphyxia or not, they're usually classified as accidental. However, given the uncertain circumstances of this case and the additional collection of circumstances of this case, we felt that the most appropriate manner of death is undetermined.
So could Ricky White also be charged with second-degree murder? Well, right now, he isn't, and his defense attorney says since Ricky never met Adan, it should exclude him from the crime. But the judge ruled there was probable cause that Ricky was principal to Danette's actions, since there were 30 calls between the two and since Danette gave Ricky Adan's credit card PIN. And the judge said both are a danger to society, so they both remain in jail. So from what was revealed in court, it seems like there was a plan in place this whole time. Let's bring on criminal defense attorney Safa Robinson-Ferrer to get her take on this case. Safa, thank you so much for joining me. I always appreciate you having you on. What do you make of this seemingly organized planning to rob Adan Manzano, who, as a result, ended up dead?
You know, unfortunately, this is not surprising. A lot of times we see in these situations where there's an escort type situation, someone may go, to a room or to some sort of location with one of the individuals, and ultimately it becomes a robbery scheme. So unfortunately, these things do happen. It's not a surprise. And I know that there's a second individual that's been looped in as a co-defendant, who is also under an accomplice liability theory here, which they're prosecuting as well.
And I remember, first covering the case, and for the longest time, I believed that Danette Colbert had acted alone, allegedly. But I was pretty shocked and stunned to find out that there was another person involved in this as well, too. Now, they're not charged with second-degree murder as of right now, as we're recording this interview. But, as a detective appeared in court this week, the text messages that he testified to were pretty shocking. Got the phone code. He got money, waiting for him to sleep. Then there were 30 calls between Danette Colbert and Ricky White. What are your thoughts on the text messages and even their communications with one another throughout all of this?
Yeah, most definitely. I think there's an argument to be made that this individual could at some point be charged with second degree murder as well. And the reason is because under Louisiana statute, there is a caveat, of course, dealing with accomplice liability, not only that you're the primary actor, but also if you're involved in the facilitation of, say, narcotics, or if you distribute those narcotics to someone who then distributes it to another person, and that person dies as a result of that consumption of those narcotics, then another individual or that person A will be liable or could be deemed liable. And so I think that may be the case here. I think if the prosecution is able to narrow down where they got this narcotic from, or the Xanax, and it's linked to that second individual, then that person certainly can be on the line for the murder in the second degree prosecution.
And detectives say that Danette Colbert didn't intend to murder Adan, but to simply just cause unconsciousness. But does intent really matter? Because at the end of the day, Adan Manzano isn't here anymore. He died as a result of what the medical examiner talked about, as far as he was laying face down in a pillow. He had ethanol, alcohol in his system, Xanax in his system. But again, does intent really matter because of what it ended up being the result of what happened?
Yeah, so generally speaking, intent always matters with respect to murder charges and things of that nature, because that's the culpable mental state that the prosecution has to prove that person A intended to bring about the death of person B. However, in this particular case and under Louisiana law, it appears that it doesn't only have to be intent, but if you administer a narcotic to an individual and the administration of that narcotic results in their death, although you may not have intended for that death to come about, you are subject to liability under the second degree murder statute. So intent generally does matter, but in this case, it's either going to go on an intent theory or on a theory where the narcotics were administered and as a result of that, the death occurred.
And Ricky White's attorney, he argues that he being Ricky White, never physically met Adan. And so essentially he didn't really commit a crime. That's essentially what the argument was. But what are your thoughts on that argument, that just because Ricky White wasn't in the vehicle or never physically met Adan, that just kind of negates his culpability in what had all happened?
It does matter, because ultimately what the prosecution is going to try to prove is that these two individuals acted in concert. This second individual was also a part of either renting a car, which she used to transport herself and the victim to the hotel. If there's any other communications or correspondence, which we know they do have, indicating text codes and things like that to get into the bank account, and they are assisting one another in that activity, that shows an acting of concert or working together to facilitate this robbery. And so although the second defendant, he has not had any personal contact with the victim in this case, he certainly can be liable based on the activity of robbing this individual and ultimately possibly the death of this individual as well.
And at first, when Ricky White was named as one, a suspect, and two, after he was arrested, authorities kind of painted, or obviously with initial information, it's kind of hard to really kind of gather what the full scope of everything is. But initially, it just seems like Ricky White was a transient, according to police in Kenner, Louisiana. But the judge at the hearing last week said that the relationship between the two was more like prostitute pimp, and it was that type of situation. What are your thoughts just overall about the relationship and dynamic between Danette Colbert and Ricky White?
Absolutely. It does not surprise me that, and the judge is going to have a bit more information because he was in the courtroom holding that hearing, and the investigators certainly also will have additional information that we aren't always privy to. But in a lot of situations like this, and I've seen it time and time again in my own practice as a defense attorney, is you see men and women or two or more individuals who may set up some sort of robbery scheme to, use somebody, get them in a vulnerable position, and then rob them for their belongings. And with the pimp prostitute relationship, so to speak, it's not uncommon for that to be the case. And Mr. White would be receiving some sort of benefit from Danette's activity. And so again, that acting in concert, we know in a lot of relationships where it deals with a pimp and a prostitute, or typical relationships like that there is an exchange between the two. There is acting in concert and things like that because they want to further the goal of the robbery to get money or whatever the case may be.
And in your opinion, given Danette's past, and when I say her past, the allegations of her doing this to other men, not even just in Louisiana alone, but also in Vegas, she's been accused of that. She was even on probation when she was arrested, but her past where she's faced these similar allegations combined with this case being Adan's case, do you think it's a slam dunk for the prosecution?
I don't think it's going to be a slam dunk for the prosecution. The thing about it is this. Where did this Xanax come from? And I'm sure that the prosecution will have a theory that it came from Miss White or Mr. White and Miss Danette. But at the off chance, because a Xanax may not solely cause the death of an individual, right? But there may be a combination of alcohol, or if the decedent maybe had some other medical diagnosis or other medications in his system that would have contributed to his death, then we're having a conversation of what specifically was the cause of his death. Was what the defendant or the defendants in this case administered to him the exact cause of the death? So we'll have to find that out. So the prosecution is going to have to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. I always say when cases get to trial, it's because neither side has the best case. And so the optics aren't great for the defense in this case, but it's not going to be a slam dunk for the prosecution at all either.
Especially, and I know they're going to they relied heavily on the toxicology report in the first place to even kind of go forward with the second-degree murder charge, because at first she was just facing property crime. So I can understand how it could be a little dicey for the prosecution as well, too. And in terms of just the overall evidence in the case, you have the victim's phone and credit cards were found at Danette's home. Investigators say Xanax was found in his system, but he didn't have a prescription, and no drugs were found in his hotel room. It is actually found in Danette's home as well, but it's unclear if that was the exact same drug or from that exact same prescription or anything like that. Then you have the text messages, you have the calls, whether or not this is circumstantial, because I guess that would be what this all is, but it appears that's a lot is stacked against her specifically. What are your thoughts on just this overwhelming amount of evidence?
Absolutely. And so to exactly your point, this is circumstantial evidence. And what the prosecution, if this case makes it to trial, is going to ask the jury to infer is that she was the one that administered this drug, that it could not have come from anywhere else. And to your point, there was no Xanax found in his room or anything like that. He didn't have a prescription for it. So it had to have come from Miss Danette, this particular defendant. So lots of circumstantial evidence, significant circumstantial evidence in this case. Again, there's always strengths and weaknesses to both sides, but the odds are certainly stacked against the defendants in this case, and it would not surprise me if this case were to plead out before trial, or further to be a finding of guilt at trial.
And as a criminal defense attorney yourself, how are you defending Danette Colbert if she were to be your client?
With Danette Colbert, what I'd want to do is focus on the way that the police obtained this extra evidence, the way the police, and it's really going to be key here, how they got to obtain the Xanax. Did she consent to the search of her home or her property? Yes or no? Was that consent appropriate for the circumstances, or was she coerced into giving consent to search her property? If it wasn't a consent search, then the second thing we question is, if there's a search warrant, is there a valid search warrant, and challenge the search warrant? Because if we can get the Xanax kept out or taken out, and that's going to be the prosecution's key piece of evidence to say, here is the controlled substance that resulted in the death of this individual, then that's definitely going to be a win for the defense, and that would be what I'd try to do.
And do you see, if you had a crystal ball down the line in the future, do you think it's possible that Ricky White ends up facing the same charge? Or do you think that his charges, that being pretty much property crimes and fraud crimes and that sort as of right now, do you see him possibly facing a murder charge later down the line?
If the first defendant, Danette, ultimately either cooperates against Mr. White and says he's the one that provided the Xanax, then he certainly could be responsible and ultimately charged with second-degree murder. Or in the alternative, if the police can make a direct connection between the Xanax, say they may have been found at her house, but they're in his name, or something of that nature that would directly confirm that he had something to do with the narcotics, then I could absolutely see him having a second-degree murder charge added to his indictment.
And what I find, just troubling about this case overall is that Adan Manzano, the victim in this case, he was very young. He wasn't even 30 years old. He was down in New Orleans in the first place to cover the Super Bowl for his job. But why do you think it is that Danette Colbert and Ricky White specifically, allegedly, targeted him, targeted him in general? Because at the end of the day, I just can't fathom just seeing all these different people in New Orleans. I'm sure everything was a lot of fun during the Super Bowl, and maybe, given that they, Danette and Ricky, have been kind of running this scheme from the reports that have been suggesting that they've been doing this a while and had it down to a science, it seems like. But again, going back to why Adan specifically, what are your thoughts on that?
I think in the defendant's eyes, this was the perfect victim. This was an individual that was in New Orleans for work purposes for the Super Bowl. And so it's not a situation where he's down there with a group of friends and has other individuals around him to ensure that he's safe or in the right, safest situation. He's there for work. The likelihood is he was probably there by himself, which again makes him an easier target. Not only that, but the network he worked for, Telemundo, there could have been some cultural variances that also had impacted or had to do with why they chose him as well. There could have possibly been a language barrier to some sort of extent. And not only that, but if he had already had alcohol in his system and had been intoxicated at the time where he met the defendant, then that would have made him, again, an easier target because you're more laid back, you're loose, your judgment is not what it normally is without alcohol in your system. So I do think that this, unfortunately, was a situation where he was just deemed to be the perfect victim by these defendants. They knew he probably had money because of what he did for work and because he was at the Super Bowl even for work, and took advantage of this man.
Yeah, and it's just heartbreaking overall because he was a father. He lost his wife probably a year before his own death. So now his child is left without both parents. And, despite what a lot of people think about our business and going, into television, especially on assignment, for the most part, a lot of times people are by themselves. It's not a situation where there's a duo or security is added to it. And maybe that's a conversation for another day. But in terms of just this business overall, a lot of times we don't have extra people to kind of be there just to look out for us, watch over us, that type of thing. Safa Robinson-Freer, I want to thank you so much, as always, for joining me today. Before we sign you off, though, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, thank you for having me, as always.
Thank you for being here. Online records show Danette Colbert and Ricky White remain in the Jefferson Parish Correctional Center on no bond. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.